Hello, this is Laura Knight with Friendly Planet Club, and this is episode 3 of my interview series, Welcome Guest. And today we have poet Brian Sonia-Wallace. And I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we can just hop right into the conversation and get to know him better. Brian is a professional poet who has written poems for thousands of people based on the stories they tell him with his company, RENTpoet. He shares his experience in his book, The Poetry of Strangers, What I Learned Traveling America with a Typewriter. He is currently serving as the West Hollywood City Poet Laureate and an Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellow. Brian lives in West Hollywood with his feelings of existential dread and an increasing number of houseplants. You're so talented and funny. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and talk.
I met Brian about 5 years ago at a coffee shop, and it was a very informal meeting. My mom and I grabbed some coffee. We walked by, and I saw this man with a little typewriter and a cute dog, and it said RENTpoet. And we just briefly chatted, and he said, I write poems. So my mom talked about her dog that had recently passed, and you just, in a matter of seconds, just started typing away, and then gave my mom this beautiful little piece of paper, and she has it framed in her house. And recently, by conversation, she told me, she's like, hey, what do you think that poet is up to? And I, of course, went straight to Instagram and found out that you just published a book and you traveled across America and you're represented by Harper Collins. It's unbelievable, everything that you've accomplished in such a short amount of time. What were you doing before you became a poet, and how did you start RENTpoet?
I was working in affordable housing, as poets do. I graduated college with a degree in sustainable development and started my career doing grant writing for like community wealth building, affordable housing, really focusing on I want to say like the financial aspects of social justice, which are, you follow the money and you know what the story is. And really it was not a natural segue, but an incredibly useful thing to do to understand how to write grants and to understand, like, to not be afraid to talk about money. I feel like that's such a pervasive thing in our culture. The idea that, especially as artists, the idea that we would say, hi, I am going to, write you this poem and I expect you to pay me for it. Like, that doesn't really happen. So in some ways it was a natural segue. And I actually started writing poems for strangers on a typewriter back in like 2012. I think it was the year after I graduated college, and I'd been a theater kid and was really struggling in LA with having everybody sort of scooped up by film and TV and not able to get together and rehearse and like work with text and make plays. And it was something I found that I could do where I was the only one who had to show up, and my audience was whoever stopped, and they were also my collaborator. And we got to have this moment that was a poem, but it was also sort of a scene, and the scene of, like you said, and I love hearing where these poems end up, like encountering a poet at a coffee shop and then having this little piece that, and this is, I think, the magic that I'm working on trying to understand and document, like that your mom still has that poem is so cool, and that it's something that she still thinks about and talks about, and that an encounter with an artist can be meaningful for us personally and also meaningful for our like conception of what's possible in the world and what exists in the world.
What I also love about your persona is that you're very approachable. And with poetry, for me, sometimes it almost feels like it's very intellectual. It's perhaps too deep. This belongs in an academia setting. So there's this reluctancy to, get myself involved. And with you and your typewriter, in public spaces that probably you wouldn't expect an artist to be there and give the art instantly. Just the way your mind work is unbelievable to me, to type that fast and really be able to grasp the emotion that another person is sharing with you. And I know that this eventually led to you coming up with the concept of a book writing stories based off the poetry that you were making?
Yeah, it happened in sort of a roundabout way as always. I'll say first of all, yeah, poets are real good at scaring people off poetry. I don't know why. They wanna be cool. They wanna be the only ones in the club. But yeah, the book happened, in part because I had been doing this for 4 or 5 years at that point and collecting stories and starting to do a little bit more travel and applying for writers' residencies and really taking this practice and saying, not just can I show up at the farmer's market, can I show up on the street, but can I pitch this? Can I pitch this to Amtrak trains and have them give me a cross country train trip in exchange for writing poems for passengers in the observation deck car? Can I pitch this to the Mall of America and have them pop up in the biggest mall in the US in Minnesota? And that's what actually led to the book. Whenever people are like, well, how did how do you pitch a book? How do you even begin to do this? I always say, like, get on the news, which is silly, but it is so how, we live in this attention economy, and I think it's how the world works. So that residency with the Mall of America got a New York Times article because it was ridiculous, right? Like, why is a mall hiring a poet? What's going on here? And the publisher actually reached out to me and said, you're doing something kind of weird and interesting here, and we're looking for thought pieces about the country and what's going on. And this is, mid Trump years. You're traveling around and kind of talking to people about what's important to them and like what's on their hearts, I would maybe say, and that might be useful for us to know. And so it really kind of progressed from there.
How did the invitation present itself for you to be at the Mall of America, and explain to me what that environment was like?
Yeah, I saw a post on Facebook that a friend I think shared. It was like, "Look, the Mall of America is looking for a writer in residence." And I was read the language and they had all this like contest language and I was like, "Oh, they don't know what they want." And that's okay. Like I'll send them some pictures. Like I'll give them an idea. Like they don't want someone to write a novel in a cafe. Like they want someone to be part of the scene. And when I arrived, this is one of the stories in the book. I'll show the copy. It's called The Poetry of Strangers. One of the first things that they did is they took me to a like Nickelodeon slime branded chair that they had constructed. It's all Nickelodeon franchise tie-ins, and had me sit on it. And after about 5 seconds, the chair farted, and you jump because you're not expecting a chair to do that. They're like, "Oh yes, this is the interactive photo op that we've installed, and it's a way to get people to give genuine reactions by sitting on a plastic photo op chair." And I was like, "Oh, this is my job here. I am like the farting chair part two, but with poetry." And like, what a perfect role for a poet, and especially in this day and age and in this country. Like I am a big believer that we exist in space that's been commercialized and commoditized, and also like we are always kind of reappropriating it and using it for our own like very human ends. And I love the idea that even in corporate spaces, that's something that we have the power to do, and that it's a way of kind of shifting that narrative or flipping that narrative.
Being in a mall type environment and the novelty of it with all these fun attractions, and then you have a poet, and I would expect also people do have a certain respect because they know you're a writer and this is a craft. So are they coming and they're approaching you as something like, oh, this is funny and silly, or were people being very honest and maybe revealing themselves to you at certain points that maybe it could have been uncomfortable?
A little bit of both, which I kind of like. Like you definitely get I always try to bring an extra typewriter when I set up to write, so that if kids come up to the table, like a kid doesn't want me to write them a poem, like a kid wants to play with a typewriter. And that's I think important, and as valuable or more valuable than me trying to make a story about a unicorn. That idea of giving that experience. And at the same time, like with the mall in particular, anywhere where I set up where it's kind of advertised, there's a really interesting effect that happens where people, when they come, sort of make little pilgrimages, and they'll bring like a photo album, and they'll be like, "I want a poem about my daughter, and here's 30 photos that I've selected and curated and gone through," or "Here's the poems that I wrote or the letters that we've written back and forth." Like it's amazing to have folks every now and then, like bring me material, you know, like actually say, And the normal thing, I always joke, I'd say about 10% of the poems I write about are for people's dogs. And inevitably, you've got a picture of your dog on your phone, and it's like, if you're telling me about your dog, you're not just gonna tell me, you're gonna show me, and there's something so cool. For me, like, I think I'm an only child, I'm bad at small talk, I don't like it, and I love being able to sit down, and because I've got a typewriter in front of me, rather than saying, "Oh, how are you? What do you do? How's the weather?" I can go, "No, what's important to you right now? What do you need documented? What do you want to think about? What do you want to remember? What do you want to kind of, I wouldn't say it in these terms, but like process in this moment?" And there is very much a sense, I'm not a therapist, I don't have that background, and I think my job, certainly isn't to prescribe solutions to people, but just to listen to what their experience is and reflect that and kind of help them find the language for it. And I'd say about half of that, or even more than half of that, is the conversation before the poem. And
Mhm.
then the poem is the artifact of it. The poem's like a receipt of the interaction, you know?